The heavy snowfall painted Manhattan white on that fateful December morning. From his corner office on the 50th floor, millionaire James Carter watched a small figure trudging through the blizzard below. The girl's thin coat offered little protection against the brutal cold. Something about her determined gait made him pause. Or that moment would haunt him for the next decade. The day he first saw Emily Stewart, the brilliant young girl whose education he would fund, whose mother's death he would inadvertently ignore, and who would eventually orchestrate the most sophisticated plan to destroy everything he had built. One act of kindness, 10 years of calculated revenge. James Carter's world was built on calculated decisions and measured generosity. From his mahogany-lined office in the Carter Building, he had spent 2 decades crafting not just a business empire, but a legacy of philanthropy that made headlines in every major newspaper. The Education First Foundation, his pride and joy, had funded the education of over 300 underprivileged students. Yet each recipient was chosen with the same precision he used to acquire companies. The snow continued to fall outside his window, reminding him of another winter day 5 years ago. His daughter Sarah's photo still sat on his desk, her bright smile frozen at 16. The doctors had called it a rare form of leukemia. All his millions couldn't save her, but he could save others in her name. Each scholarship awarded felt like a small redemption, a way to keep her memory alive. "Mr. Carter," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board is waiting for the quarterly scholarship review." He straightened his Italian silk tie, a habit from his humble beginnings that wealth hadn't erased. The boardroom fell silent as he entered. 20 faces turned to him, each representing old money and older prejudices. They called his scholarship program James's pet project behind his back. To them, charity was a tax write-off, a social obligation to be fulfilled with minimum effort. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of his success, "this winter we have 300 applications. Each one represents not just a student, but a family's hope for a better future." He could see some board members shifting uncomfortably. They preferred discussing profit margins to poverty. His eyes drifted to the window, watching the thickening snow. The weather forecast predicted the worst winter in decades. Somewhere out there, families were struggling to choose between heating and eating. He knew that reality intimately. He'd lived it before building his empire. But success had a way of creating distance, of turning personal experience into abstract understanding. The photo albums in his private study told the story of his rise from a small construction company to a diversified corporation spanning real estate, finance, and technology, each venture calculated, each risk measured. His wife Diana used to say he treated his charity the same way, seeking maximum return on investment, even if that return was measured in changed lives rather than dollars. Diana had left 3 years ago, claiming he'd forgotten how to feel, that his compassion had become mechanical. "You help people like you're solving math problems," she'd said during their last argument. The words still stung, especially on cold days like this when the empty penthouse felt particularly hollow. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary entered with a thick folder, the latest scholarship applications. James opened it, scanning the first few pages with practiced efficiency. Each application told a story of struggle, of potential waiting to be unlocked. He'd trained himself to look past the emotional appeals to find truly promising candidates. But today something felt different. Perhaps it was the weather, or Sarah's memory weighing heavily on his mind. For the first time in years, he found himself lingering over the personal essays, reading about dreams deferred and hardships endured. One application in particular caught his eye, a girl with exceptional test scores and a single mother working 3 jobs. Little did he know, this application would change everything. Sometimes the most carefully measured decisions lead to the most unpredictable consequences. The Stewart apartments sat on the 15th floor of a crumbling building in the Bronx, where the elevator worked only when it chose to. Emily Stewart sat at her second-hand desk, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, as she studied under the dim light of a table lamp. Her breath formed small clouds in the unheated room they'd had to choose between heat and her mother's medication this month. Through the frost-covered window, she could see the lights of Manhattan glittering like distant stars. Those buildings housed the people her mother cleaned for, the executives whose children attended the prestigious schools Emily could only dream about. At 16, she already understood the invisible walls that divided their world from hers. Emily, her mother's voice weaker than it used to be, called from the doorway. Margaret Stewart stood there in her worn nurse's aide uniform, her face pale from another double shift. The persistent cough she'd developed hadn't improved, but she refused to miss work. Still studying, sweetheart. Emily quickly hid the past-due utility bills she'd been calculating between her textbook pages. Just finishing up, Mom. How was work? Margaret's smile couldn't hide her exhaustion. She'd been cleaning offices since losing her nursing job when the small clinic closed. Now she worked 3 jobs: morning shifts at a nursing home, afternoon office cleaning, and weekend shifts at a diner. The schedule was killing her, but she never complained. Mrs. Patterson at the nursing home asked about your grades again, Margaret said, suppressing another cough. I told her about your perfect score on the state math exam. She says her husband's firm sometimes offers scholarships. Emily's heart tightened. She'd seen how these opportunities worked. The pity in their eyes when they discovered where she lived, the subtle shift in their tone when they learned her father had abandoned them when she was 3. Their charity came with invisible strings, unspoken expectations of gratitude and submission. But she kept studying. Every night, after finishing her homework, she'd read extra chapters ahead. While other kids her age posted on social media about parties and shopping, Emily was teaching herself calculus from borrowed library books. Her teachers called her gifted. She called it survival. The wind howled outside, rattling the poorly insulated windows. Emily pulled the blanket tighter, thinking about the scholarship applications spread across her desk. Each one represented a chance to break free, to build a different life. But they also represented something else, a system where people like her had to prove themselves worthy of opportunity. I made some soup, Margaret said, but her words dissolved into a coughing fit that seemed worse than usual. Emily rushed to her mother's side, guiding her to sit down. In the harsh overhead light, she could see how much weight her mother had lost, how the shadows under her eyes had deepened. The pneumonia she'd been fighting wasn't getting better, but they couldn't afford the specialists the clinic recommended. Later that night, after her mother had finally fallen asleep, Emily stood at the window watching the snowfall. Somewhere in those glittering towers, people were making decisions about futures like hers. They would review applications, nod at sob stories, and congratulate themselves on their generosity. They had no idea what it really meant to live on this side of the invisible wall. She pulled out a wrinkled newspaper clipping about James Carter's Education First Foundation. His smiling photo showed a man who seemed kind, who spoke about creating opportunities. But Emily had learned early that kindness from the wealthy usually came with a price. She'd seen how charity could be both a ladder and a chain. Still, she had no choice. Her mother's health was deteriorating, and this scholarship might be their only hope. Emily straightened her shoulders, returning to her desk. She would play their game, excel by their rules, and someday she would change the rules themselves. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering both mansions and tenements in the same white blanket, creating an illusion of equality that would melt with the morning sun. The Carter building lobby felt like another world. Emily's worn boots left small puddles on the marble floor as she waited, clutching her application folder with frozen fingers. Around her, people in expensive suits barely noticed the thin girl in the second-hand coat, their designer shoes clicking past on their way to important meetings. Miss Stewart, the receptionist's polite but distant voice called. Mr. Carter will see you now. The elevator ride to the 50th floor seemed eternal. Emily used the mirrored walls to check her appearance one last time, her mother's carefully pressed blouse, her hair neatly braided, the small patch on her coat sleeve hidden by strategic positioning. Every detail mattered. She'd rehearsed this interview 100 times in front of their cracked bathroom mirror. James Carter stood as she entered, his imposing figure silhouetted against the snow-filled window. "Emily, please come," in his voice was warmer than she expected, tinged with something that might have been curiosity or compassion. She couldn't tell which was more dangerous. "Thank you for considering my application, Mr. Carter." Her voice came out steady, practiced. She'd learned early that showing nervousness was a luxury she couldn't afford. He gestured to a chair that probably cost more than her mother's monthly salary. "Your test scores are remarkable, perfect marks in mathematics and sciences. Your teacher's recommendations are quite enthusiastic." He paused, studying her with eyes that seemed to see too much. "Tell me, Emily, what drives you?" It was the question she'd prepared for, yet something made her abandon her rehearsed answer. Perhaps it was the photo on his desk, a teenage girl with his eyes, smiling from behind glass. "Truth, Mr. Carter? The sound of my mother coughing at night after working 3 jobs, the way people look through us in stores, the fact that talent means nothing without opportunity, and opportunity seems to have a price tag." A heavy silence fell. Snow tapped against the window, a gentle counterpoint to the tension in the room. James Carter's expression changed, something flickering behind his composed facade. For a moment he wasn't the millionaire philanthropist, but someone who recognized the fire in her words. "That's unusually honest," he said finally, leaning forward. "Most candidates tell me about their dreams of changing the world." "I do want to change the world, Mr. Carter." Emily met his gaze. "But first I need to change our circumstances. My mother's sick. She won't survive another winter of choosing between heat and medicine." He stood abruptly, walking to the window. "Your mother. She works as a nurse's aide. And an office cleaner, and a waitress." Each word carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. "She used to be a registered nurse before the clinic closed." James turned back, his expression unreadable. "You understand this scholarship is highly competitive. We receive hundreds of applications." "I understand everything is competitive when you're born on the wrong side of advantage, Mr. Carter." Emily's voice remained calm, but her hands tightened on the folder. "That's why I'm not here asking for charity. I'm offering an investment opportunity." His eyebrow raised. "An investment? In potential, in determination, in someone who understands that opportunities like this come with responsibility." She pulled out her academic records, laying them on his desk with steady hands. "These aren't just grades, Mr. Carter. They're proof of what I can do with limited resources. Imagine what I could achieve with actual support." For a long moment, James Carter said nothing. He picked up her transcripts, then looked at the photo on his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "You remind me of someone, Emily. Someone who taught me that talent can come from unexpected places." The interview shifted then, becoming less an evaluation and more a conversation. He asked about her studies, her plans, her understanding of various subjects. With each answer, Emily felt the dynamic between them changing, though she couldn't name how. As snow continued falling outside, neither realized they were setting in motion events that would transform both their lives. James saw a chance for redemption, a bright mind he could help shape. Emily saw a door opening, not understanding it might become a cage she'd spend years planning to escape. "I believe we're done here," he said finally, standing. "My assistant will contact you next week with the details." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the Education First family, Emily." Her hand met his, small but firm. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Carter." As she left his office, James watched her walk away, struck by an inexplicable feeling that he'd just made either the best or worst decision of his life. Emily stepped into the elevator, her reflection in the mirrored walls showing a girl on the brink of transformation, for better or worse. The snow fell harder now, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. nature's way of hiding the paths that led people to life-changing moments. The boardroom of Carter Enterprises hummed with tension on that snowy December morning. 20 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from mild annoyance to open skepticism. James Carter stood at the head of the table, Emily's application spread before him. "Gentlemen, I called this special meeting to discuss an exceptional candidate. His voice carried the weight of authority earned through decades of success. Emily Stewart's academic achievements are unprecedented in our program's history." Richard Maxwell, his oldest friend on the board, leaned forward. "James, while her scores are impressive, there are concerns." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The girl lives in one of the worst neighborhoods in the Bronx. Her mother works 3 minimum-wage jobs. There's no father in the picture." "Precisely why she needs this opportunity," James countered, his jaw tightening slightly. Charles Winchester, representing the old money faction of the board, cleared his throat. "We must consider the foundation's reputation, James. This isn't one of your regular scholarships. This is the Sarah Carter Memorial Scholarship. It bears your daughter's name." The room fell silent. Mentioning Sarah was usually off-limits, and everyone knew it. James gripped the edge of the table, memories of his daughter threatening to overwhelm him. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow swirled against the darkening sky. "I'm well aware of whose name is on this scholarship." Charles James's voice was dangerously quiet. "Sarah would have been the same age as Emily. She would have wanted." "With all due respect," interrupted Theodore Banks, "the Foundation's legal counsel, we can't make decisions based on emotional parallels. The girl's background raises red flags. Single-parent household, history of financial instability, no connections to speak of." James pulled out Emily's essay, his hands steady despite his rising anger. "Let me read you something. Opportunity isn't just about opening doors, it's about changing the architecture of possibility itself. Every calculation I solve, every test I ace, every hour I study while others sleep is a brick in the foundation of a future I refuse to be denied." He looked around the table. "This girl scored higher than any applicant we've ever had, despite studying in an unheated apartment because her mother had to choose between heat and medicine. She taught herself calculus from library books. James," Richard interjected gently, "we understand your passion for this cause. But there are other candidates. Caroline Henderson, for instance, her father's a state senator, or Michael Chang, whose family owns." "No," James's voice cut through the room like steel. "I didn't build this company by playing it safe. I didn't create this foundation to perpetuate the same systems that keep talented people trapped in poverty." Charles Winchester's face reddened. "This isn't about systems, James. It's about making responsible choices. The girl has no social graces, no understanding of our world. She'll never fit in at Somerset Academy." "Perhaps Somerset Academy needs someone who doesn't fit in," James replied, thinking of Emily's fierce determination during their interview. "Sometimes disruption is exactly what a system needs." The debate continued for hours. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the city in white. Inside, the battle lines were clearly drawn. The old guard protecting their carefully curated world versus James's vision of merit-based opportunity. Finally, Richard called for a vote. Those in favor of awarding the Sarah Carter Memorial Scholarship to Emily Stewart. Hands raised slowly. James counted silently. It would be close. 8 in favor, Richard announced. Those opposed. More hands. James's heart sank. 11 opposed. "I'm sorry, James. The board has spoken." The room fell silent, expecting James to accept the decision gracefully as he always did. Instead, he gathered Emily's application papers slowly, deliberately. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the chill of the winter storm outside, "I seem to have created some confusion. This wasn't a request for permission. This was a courtesy notification. Emily Stewart will receive the scholarship. If anyone has concerns about this decision, They're welcome to resign from the board." Charles Winchester stood up, face purple with rage. "You can't do this, James. There are procedures, protocols." "I just did." James turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. Starting next year, all scholarship applications will be reviewed blind, no names, no backgrounds, no family connections, just merit." He smiled coldly. "I trust there are no objections." As he walked back to his office, James knew he'd just made powerful enemies. But looking at Sarah's photo on his desk, he felt certain he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, he thought, watching the snow transform the city below, real change requires a willingness to weather a few storms. What he couldn't know was that this decision would set in motion events that would shake his world to its foundation. In trying to open a door for Emily Stewart, he had unknowingly unlocked something far more complex and dangerous than mere social disruption. The snow continued to fall, nature's reminder that even the most carefully constructed barriers can be buried under the right conditions. Somerset Academy stood like a medieval castle against the winter sky, its stone walls and ivy-covered facades a stark contrast to Emily's former public school. Her used uniform, carefully altered by her mother's trembling hands, marked her as different from the moment she stepped through its ornate gates. Miss Stewart, her calculus teacher, announced one morning, "Perfect score again. Perhaps you'd like to explain your solution to the class." The other students shifted in their seats, designer bags rustling. Emily could feel their stares, some curious, others resentful. The scholarship girl who dared to excel. After class, Alexandra Winchester, Charles Winchester's daughter, blocked her path. "Daddy says you're James Carter's latest charity project. That he only chose you because you remind him of his dead daughter." Her perfect smile didn't reach her eyes. "How does it feel, being a replacement?" Emily's hands clenched, but her voice remained steady. "About as good as being Daddy's disappointment." Despite all his connections, she walked away, Alexandra's shocked gasp following her down the marble hallway. At home, things were deteriorating. Her mother's cough had worsened, the apartment colder than ever. Emily found her one morning, collapsed in the kitchen before her dawn shift. "It's nothing," Margaret insisted, trying to stand. "Just a bit dizzy. The scholarship doesn't cover living expenses, sweetheart. We need the income." Emily wrote to James Carter that evening, her first request for help since receiving the scholarship. The letter was carefully worded, pride warring with desperation in every line. She waited 3 days for a response. None came. She excelled anyway. Perfect grades. Academic competitions. Leadership roles. Each achievement a brick in the wall she was building between her past and future. The school newspaper ran a feature on her scholarship success story. The photos showed her in the library, carefully angled to hide her worn shoes. "Your daughter would be proud," she overheard a teacher telling James during his quarterly visit to the school. Emily, hidden behind a bookshelf, watched his face change at the mention of Sarah. Something flickered in his eyes, pain, guilt, or perhaps both. That night, her mother's cough turned to blood. The emergency room was crowded, fluorescent lights harsh against Margaret's pale face. "Insurance won't cover the specialist," the doctor said apologetically. "Perhaps there are charitable programs." Emily called James Carter's office repeatedly. His secretary was polite but firm. "Mr. Carter is in Tokyo for crucial business negotiations. I'll pass along your messages." She found her mother's hidden savings that night, $342.17 in an old cookie tin. A note inside read, "For your college books." My brilliant girl Emily held the money and wept, rage mixing with determination. The next day she approached Richard Maxwell after a school board meeting. "Sir, I need to reach Mr. Carter. It's urgent. My mother." "James has given you an incredible opportunity, Miss Stewart," he interrupted smoothly. "Best not to appear grasping. There are many worthy candidates who would gladly take your place." Winter deepened. Emily maintained her perfect grades while spending nights at her mother's hospital bedside. She wrote algorithms between hospital visits, solved differential equations under harsh waiting room lights. But the scholarship that was supposed to be their salvation had become a gilded cage. One evening, Alexandra found her in the school bathroom, splashing water on her face. For once, the popular girl's smirk was absent. "You look terrible, Stuart." "Not all of us can afford personal stylists," Emily replied tiredly. "No, I mean, you look like I did. When my mum was dying," Alexandra's voice softened. "Daddy said not to tell you, but Carter's been screening your calls. Board policy about maintaining professional distance or something." The words hit harder than any insult could have. Emily stared at her reflection, seeing not just her exhausted face but the entire system that kept people like her mother dying, while men like James Carter discussed professional distance in boardrooms. That night, studying her mother's sleeping form in the hospital bed, something crystallized in Emily's heart. She would continue to excel, to play their game, to be their perfect scholarship success story. But one day they would understand the true cost of their charity. Her mother stirred, voice weak. "Promise me you won't let this make you bitter, Emily. Promise me you'll use this opportunity." "I promise." Mom, Emily whispered, the words tasting like ashes. "I'll use every single bit of it." Outside the hospital window, snow fell silently, covering the city in a deceptive blanket of peace. Emily Stuart, 16 years old, top of her class at Somerset Academy, watched it fall and began to plan. James Carter's generosity had opened a door. But she was beginning to understand that sometimes open doors were just beautiful traps, and true freedom required something more than gratitude. It required revolution. The worst winter storm in decades paralyzed New York City that February. From her mother's hospital room, Emily watched ambulances struggle through snow-choked streets. Margaret Stewart's condition had deteriorated rapidly, the pneumonia now complicated by advanced-stage lung cancer that had gone undiagnosed while she worked through her symptoms. "Your mother needs immediate specialized treatment," Dr. Harrison explained gently. Without it, he left the sentence unfinished, but Emily understood. The clock was ticking, and they were out of options. She made her final attempt to reach James Carter that morning. The hospital's payphone felt cold against her ear as she dialed the numbers she now knew by heart. Mr. Carter's office. "Please," Emily's voice cracked slightly. "Tell him it's Emily Stuart. My mother. She's dying. The treatment costs $150,000. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work, pay it back somehow. Just please, let me speak to him." "I'm sorry, Miss Stuart. Mr. Carter is in an emergency board meeting regarding storm damage to company properties. I'll pass along your message." Emily hung up, her reflection in the phone booth's glass showing a girl aged beyond her years. Down the hall, she could hear her mother's racking coughs echoing off sterile walls. Alexandra Winchester found her there an hour later, still staring at the phone. "Emily? Dad told me you've been trying to reach Carter for once." Her voice held no malice. "The board's implementing new policies about scholarship recipients. They're worried about liability issues." Emily turned slowly. Liability issues. If they help one student's family, others might expect the same. Alexandra shifted uncomfortably. Dad says it could set a dangerous precedent. The fluorescent lights flickered, emergency generators straining against the storm. Emily thought about precedents, about systems, about men in boardrooms discussing liability, while people died in hospital rooms. That evening, Margaret's breathing became labored. Emily sat beside her, holding her mother's thin hand as monitors beeped steadily slower. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was protesting the injustice. "I'm so proud of you," Margaret whispered between breaths. "Promise me, promise you'll use your gift. Don't let them make you small." "I won't." Mom Emily's voice was steady, even as tears froze on her cheeks. I'll become everything they fear." Margaret's eyes flickered with concern at her daughter's tone, but before she could respond, the monitors screamed into chaos. Medical staff rushed in, shouting terms Emily had learned from her mother's nursing days. She understood enough to know this was the end. "Time of death, 11:42 p.m., Dr. Harrison announced softly. Emily stood motionless, watching them disconnect machines from her mother's body. The storm howled outside, but inside her mind, everything was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The next morning she returned to Somerset Academy. Her uniform was impeccable, her homework complete, her face a mask of composure. She answered questions in class with perfect precision, accepted condolences with gracious nods. James Carter's letter of sympathy arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by his secretary. A generous check was enclosed to cover funeral expenses, along with carefully worded expressions of regret about being unreachable during her time of need. Emily placed the letter in a folder marked Future Reference right next to news clippings about Carter Enterprises' record profits and her mother's medical bills. The check she donated anonymously to the hospital's charity ward. All that night, alone in the apartment that felt too big and too empty, Emily began to write. Not a thank you note to James Carter, but a plan. Each word was a promise to her mother, to herself, to every person who had ever been told to be grateful for scraps from wealth's table. The storm finally broke at dawn. Emily watched the sun rise over a city transformed by ice and snow, thinking about how winter strips everything bare, reveals the true structure beneath the surface, like her mother's death had stripped away her last illusions about charity and kindness from above. "I'll play their game," she whispered to the empty room. "I'll be their perfect success story." And then she let the thought hang unfinished, like the final line of a story yet to be written. Outside, the first signs of thaw began to appear, water dripping from icicles like tears. Or perhaps like the first drops of a flood that would years later wash away foundations thought unshakable. In his office across town, James Carter read the report about Margaret Stewart's death with genuine sadness. He added a note to increase Emily's scholarship allowance, unaware that he had just sealed both their fates. Some debts, after all, can never be repaid with mere money. The winter of Emily's 16th year ended, taking with it her mother, her innocence, and any chance of James Carter's charity bearing the fruit he intended. In its place grew something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous, a plan 10 years in the making. Through this powerful story of betrayal, justice, and redemption, we invite Isu to join our storytelling journey. Every subscription helps us create more compelling narratives that touch hearts and challenge minds. Subscribe to our channel for weekly stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the price of redemption. Together, let's uncover more untold tales. Winter had returned to Manhattan, as bitter as the one a decade ago. James Carter stood at his familiar window, watching snowflakes dance against the darkening sky. The Wall Street Journal on his desk carried a headline that had been haunting him all morning: rising star Emily Stewart acquires 4th major company this year. The photo showed a woman he barely recognized. Gone was the grateful scholarship girl in the worn coat. In her place stood a poised executive in Savile Row tailoring, her smile as cold as the weather outside. The article praised her meteoric rise, her ruthless efficiency, her uncanny ability to identify and acquire undervalued assets. "She's done it again, hasn't she?" Richard Maxwell entered without knocking, dropping another newspaper on James's desk. "Bought out Henderson Technologies right under Patterson's nose. That's the 3rd company in our subsidiary network she's acquired this quarter." James picked up the paper, studying Emily's face for traces of the girl he'd once known. She was always brilliant. We knew that. "Brilliant is one thing, James. This is something else." Richard lowered his voice. "The board's nervous. These aren't random acquisitions. There's a pattern we're not seeing." The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Carter?" Miss Stewart's office called. She'd like to schedule a lunch meeting next week. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In 10 years, Emily had never reached out directly. Her thank you notes for the scholarship had stopped after her mother's death. She'd declined all alumni events, charity galas, foundation reunions. Her success had been observed from afar, like watching a storm gather on the horizon. Her timing is interesting, Richard mused, right after she bought Henderson, right before the board's annual review of the Education First Foundation. James remembered another winter day, another conversation about Emily Stewart, the board meeting where he'd fought for her scholarship, defied the old guard, believed he was changing a life for the better. Now, a decade later, that same board watched her systematic acquisition of companies with growing unease. Accept the lunch invitation, he told his secretary. Then, to Richard, it's time we understood what game she's playing. And if it's not a game, Richard asked quietly. Charles Winchester says she's been asking questions. About Sarah. About the foundation's early days. About decisions made 10 years ago. James turned back to the window, remembering Emily's words during their first meeting. Opportunity isn't just about opening doors, it's about changing the architecture of possibility itself. Only now did he wonder if he'd misunderstood which architecture she'd meant to change. The snow fell harder, obscuring the city below. Somewhere out there, Emily Stewart was moving pieces on a board he hadn't known they were playing on, his protégé, his charity case, his greatest success story. Or perhaps, he thought with growing unease, his greatest miscalculation. Accept the lunch, he repeated. But Richard? Start reviewing every acquisition she's made. Every company, every subsidiary, every connection. I want to know what she's building, or what she's planning to tear down. As Richard left, James picked up the newspaper again. Emily's eyes in the photo seemed to challenge him directly, carrying echoes of a promise made in a hospital room a decade ago. A promise he hadn't been there to hear, but would soon come to understand all too well. The winter wind howled outside his window, carrying with it memories of another storm, another time, and decisions that were about to demand their price. The annual Education First Foundation Gala transformed the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendure into a winter wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over New York's elite as they celebrated their own generosity, champagne flutes tinkling like distant icicles. James Carter stood at the podium, his familiar speech about opportunity and merit drawing practiced applause. 10 years ago, we decided to focus purely on talent, regardless of background. Tonight's guest speaker embodies that vision. Does she really? Emily Stewart's voice cut through the polite murmurs. She stood at the back of the room, elegant in black Chanel, her presence commanding immediate silence. No one had seen her enter. Emily, James's voice wavered slightly. We're honored you could join us. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, guests parting before her. I thought it was time I attended one of these. Celebrations. Tell me, do you all sleep better at night, knowing your pocket change funds a few scholarships? Charles Winchester stepped forward. Now see here, young lady. Young lady. Emily's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. Interesting choice of words, Charles. Wasn't that what you called me in the board meeting 10 years ago, when you said I lacked social graces? She turned to the stunned crowd. Oh, did none of you know? They keep minutes of those meetings. Fascinating reading. James gripped the podium. Emily, perhaps we should. Perhaps we should what, James? Maintain professional distance? Like when my mother was dying, her voice remained perfectly controlled, each word precisely aimed. Did you know they discuss scholarship recipients' families in those meetings? Rate our worthiness based on income brackets, zip codes, family situations. The room grew colder with each revelation. Alexandra Winchester, now a foundation board member herself, watched with a mix of horror and recognition. But that's not even the best part, Emily continued. climbing the steps to the podium. Shall we talk about the liability issues? The policy of not helping recipients' families because it might set a dangerous precedent. She faced the crowd directly. How many other mothers died while you discussed precedents in boardrooms? James reached for her arm. That's enough. No, James, it's not nearly enough, she shrugged off his touch. Let's discuss your real charity work. The tax write-offs, the strategic donations to board members' pet causes, the carefully maintained appearance of philanthropy while the actual spending goes to. Security, Charles Winchester bellowed. Emily smiled, the expression never reaching her eyes. No need. I was just leaving, she turned to James. But first, a toast to the Education First Foundation, teaching poor kids valuable lessons about how the world really works. She raised her champagne glass, then deliberately let it fall. The crash echoed through the silent room. Bill me for the carpet cleaning. I can afford it now. As she walked toward the exit, she paused beside Alexandra. Thank you, by the way, for telling me about the board policy that day in the hospital. It was educational. The door closed behind her with devastating finality. The silence that followed felt like the moment after an avalanche, when survivors first assess the damage. James stared at the shattered glass, remembering a girl in a thin coat, proudly refusing to show weakness. He'd thought he was offering her a chance at a better life. Instead, he'd given her a master class in power, privilege, and the price of underestimating those deemed worthy of charity. Well, Richard whispered beside him, now we know what game she's playing. But James wasn't so sure. Something about Emily's calculated revelations felt like a misdirection, a brilliant move masking an even more brilliant strategy. The Emily Stewart he'd watched rise through the business world never showed her hand without purpose. Outside, snow began to fall again, coating the museum steps where Emily had already disappeared into the night. Inside, New York's elite stood frozen in the aftermath of her words, their carefully constructed world of benevolent charity suddenly seeming as fragile as the shattered champagne glass on their expensive carpet. The gala ended early, guests departing with shaken expressions and hurried whispers. James remained at the podium, staring at the doors through which Emily had exited. 10 years ago, he'd opened a door for her. Now she was systematically opening every locked door in his world, exposing what lay behind each one. The morning after the gala, James sat in his darkened office, surrounded by files. Security footage played silently on his laptop, Emily entering and leaving various Carter Enterprise buildings over the past 6 months. Each visit perfectly legitimate, each meeting carefully documented. Yet something felt wrong. You need to see this, Richard entered, carrying a thick folder. Our team's been analyzing Emily's acquisitions. It's not just Henderson Technologies. She's been buying companies that form a very specific pattern. James spread the documents across his desk. A complex web of subsidiaries, partnerships, and shell companies emerged. Each acquisition seemed random at first glance, but together they formed an intricate network around Carter Enterprises' core assets. Like a spider web, Richard said quietly, she's not just building an empire, she's surrounding ours. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Carter? Miss Stewart's office confirms lunch for tomorrow at Le Bernardin. James studied Emily's corporate photograph, remembering the girl who once wrote essays about changing the architecture of possibility. What else have you found? She's been meeting with every board member who opposed her scholarship. Private dinners, charity events, golf games. Charles Winchester's son works for her now. The Pattersons' daughter too. Snow tapped against the window as James processed this information. And they're talking, James, about old board meetings, foundation policies, decisions made behind closed doors. Richard hesitated. She's gathering evidence of questionable practices. The foundation's practices are legal. Legal doesn't mean defensible in the court of public opinion. Richard placed another document on the desk. She's also been funding investigative journalists. 3 major exposes on charitable foundation corruption are scheduled to run next month. James felt the pieces shifting, forming a new pattern. The gala wasn't just an outburst, was it? More like a warning shot. She showed us she has access to board minutes, internal policies, private discussions. The question is, Richard met his eyes. What else does she have? Security footage from the previous night played on the laptop. Emily at the gala, every move precise, every word calculated. James remembered her mother's funeral, how she'd stood silent in the winter rain, refusing his offered umbrella. His assistant's voice through the intercom. Mr. Winchester wants to know how we're handling the media inquiries about last night. Tell him. James stopped, noticing something in the security footage. Emily leaving the gala, passing an envelope to someone in the crowd. He zoomed in. Richard, who's that man she's meeting? Richard leaned closer. That's Thomas Chen, head of internal auditing at our Singapore office. James felt the blood drain from his face. 10 years ago, Chen had handled the restructuring of certain foundation accounts that, if examined too closely. Cancel my meetings, James ordered. Get me everything on Emily's movements for the past 5 years. Every company she's bought, every person she's hired, every charity she's supported. As Richard hurried out, James turned to the window. The city below was disappearing under fresh snow, familiar landmarks becoming unrecognizable under winter's transformation. Like his world, he realized, as Emily Stewart methodically stripped away its facades. His phone buzzed a message from Emily, looking forward to lunch tomorrow. We have so much to discuss. James stared at the words, remembering another message from years ago. Emergency calls from a hospital, desperately seeking help that never came. Now, Emily Stewart was no longer asking for help. She was taking something else entirely. The investigation would continue through the night, revealing layers of Emily's strategy that both impressed and terrified him. She hadn't just been building a business empire. She'd been constructing an intricate trap, using every lesson the foundation had inadvertently taught her about power, privilege, and the true cost of charity. And tomorrow at lunch, he would finally learn the price of his philanthropy. The discovery came at midnight, buried in a stack of financial records. James stared at his laptop screen, his coffee long cold beside him. The Stewart Foundation for Medical Assistance, a small charity operating out of the Bronx, providing emergency medical care to families who fell through the cracks of the system. Look at the founding date, Richard pointed out. 1 week after her mother's funeral. James scrolled through the documents. The foundation had helped hundreds of families over the past decade, operating silently, efficiently, without publicity or recognition. Each case eerily similar to Margaret Stewart's working parents, critical illnesses, desperate needs denied by systematic indifference. She used her first corporate bonus to start it, Richard continued. Every acquisition, every business success, a percentage went to funding emergency medical care. But here's the interesting part. He pulled up another document. She specifically targeted families of scholarship recipients from every major charitable foundation in New York. The implications hit James like a physical blow. While they'd been watching her corporate takeovers, Emily had been building a shadow network of support for the very people their system overlooked. There's more. Richard hesitated. The foundation keeps detailed records, not just of the families they help, but of the ones they couldn't, the ones who were denied assistance by other foundations, including ours. But James opened another file. Pages of names, dates, and outcomes. A meticulous record of systemic failure, each entry a silent accusation. Among them, he found Margaret Stewart's case, annotated with board meeting minutes about liability concerns and maintaining professional distance. Sir, his assistant's voice through the intercom. I found something about the Chen connection. The Stewart Foundation has a Singapore branch. they've been providing medical assistance to families of workers in our overseas factories. The same factories where they'd cut healthcare benefits to improve profit margins. James felt the walls of his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack. "She's not just exposed our practices," Richard said quietly. "She's been systematically correcting them, helping the people we refuse to help, documenting every case where charitable foundations chose liability over lives." Snow fell silently outside as James processed this revelation. Emily hadn't just been planning revenge, she'd been building an alternative to the very system that had failed her mother. His phone buzzed. "An email from Emily, sent just moments ago, looking forward to our lunch tomorrow. Perhaps we can discuss the true cost of maintaining professional distance." Attached was a simple spreadsheet. 2 columns: lives lost and lives saved. The numbers told a story that no board meeting could justify. In trying to protect themselves from liability, they had become liable for something far worse. And Emily Stewart had spent 10 years gathering the evidence to prove it. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan when James finally looked up from the files. The snow had stopped, leaving the city transformed. Like his understanding of the woman he'd once thought was just another charity success story. Tomorrow's lunch would be more than a confrontation. It would be a reckoning with the true meaning of philanthropy and the price of treating human lives as liability concerns. As snow continued to blanket Manhattan, Emily Stewart sat in her penthouse office, watching the city lights flicker through the storm. On her desk, multiple screens displayed Carter Enterprises stock prices, falling steadily since the gala incident. Each dip represented another carefully placed piece in her decade-long game. "The Henderson acquisition is complete," her assistant reported, "and the Pattersons have agreed to sell their shares. We now control 23% of Carter Enterprises' subsidiary voting rights." Emily allowed herself a small smile. "And the board members? 5 have requested private meetings. Charles Winchester seems particularly anxious to discuss matters." Of course he was. The file she'd sent him that morning contained proof that his foundation had denied medical assistance to 3 scholarship recipients, families all of whom later died, just like her mother. Her phone buzzed, Alexandra Winchester requesting an urgent meeting. Emily thought back to that hospital corridor 10 years ago, when Alexandra had warned her about the board's liability concerns. Some debts deserved repayment. "Clear my schedule before lunch with James tomorrow," Emily instructed, "and send the second set of documents to the investigative team at the Times." The corporate chess game had been meticulously planned. Each company she'd acquired served a dual purpose, building her own power base, while systematically exposing the hollow core of Carter's charitable empire. Henderson Technologies, the company that processed the foundation's grant applications, containing records of every rejected plea for help. Patterson Global, holders of the offshore accounts where administrative costs mysteriously multiplied. Winchester Securities, managing the investments that turned tax-deductible donations into private profits. Her computer chimed. Another confidential board memo, leaked by one of the many disgruntled employees she'd cultivated over years. This one detailed discussions about using scholarship recipients' success stories in marketing materials, including her own. "Your mother would be proud," people often told her, not knowing that every corporate victory brought her closer to fulfilling her promise to Margaret Stewart. Not just revenge, but revolution. The intercom buzzed. "Miss Stewart? Mr. Chen from Singapore is on line 1. Emily picked up the phone. "Is it done?" Yes, Chen's voice was tight with suppressed emotion. "I've verified all the documents. The pattern of financial manipulation in the Foundation's overseas operations. It's worse than we thought." "Send everything to our legal team," Emily instructed. "And Thomas? Thank you for helping expose the truth." "They denied my sister medical coverage too," he replied simply. "Some debts can't be paid in dollars." After hanging up, Emily opened her safe and removed an old folder marked future reference. Inside lay her mother's final hospital bills, James Carter's belated letter of condolence, and the scholarship acceptance letter that had once seemed like salvation. Her empire had been built not just with business acumen, but with the collected pain of hundreds who'd discovered that charitable foundations often served the givers more than the receivers. Tomorrow's lunch with James would be the beginning of the end, not just for him, but for a system that traded in performative generosity while counting lives in terms of liability. A notification popped up. Carter Enterprises stock had dropped another point. In his office across town, James Carter was undoubtedly discovering the full scope of her strategy. Let him spend the night reviewing files, connecting dots, realizing how completely she'd surrounded him. Emily turned back to the window, watching snow transform the city below. Winter had always been her season, a time when nature stripped away pretense, revealing the stark reality beneath. Tomorrow, she would strip away the last illusions of James Carter's philanthropic empire. And perhaps finally her mother could rest in peace. Le Bernardine's private dining room was silent except for the soft clink of silverware. Emily sat across from James, her composure perfect as she cut into her untouched salmon. Outside, snow continued to fall, casting a ghostly pallor through the restaurant's windows. "You've been busy," James finally said, breaking the tension. "The Stewart Foundation for Medical Assistance. Quite an achievement." "Is that what your investigation revealed?" Emily's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Did you find the parallel, James? Every time your foundation denied medical assistance to a family, mine stepped in. Every life you deemed a liability, I tried to save." "I never intended." Intentions. Her knife scraped against fine china. "Let's talk about intentions. Did you intend to ignore my calls when my mother was dying? Did you intend to teach me that charity is just another form of power?" James set down his fork. "I was in Tokyo." "You were hiding behind professional distance." Emily's calm facade cracked slightly. "But you taught me well, James. Everything I know about wielding power, I learned from watching your foundation operate." She pulled out a worn envelope, his decade-old letter of condolence. This arrived 3 days after her funeral. "Did you know I waited by the phone?" A 16-year-old girl, watching her mother die, believing that her brilliant benefactor would surely help. "Emily, please." "Please what? Accept your regrets?" Like the families of Jennifer Patterson, Michael Chen, Sarah Williams, each name hit like a physical blow. All scholarship recipients' parents. All denied assistance. All dead within months of their appeals to your foundation. James paled. "How did you?" "I kept records, James. Every denial, every death, every board discussion about liability and precedent." She sipped her wine. "Your daughter Sarah, she died of leukemia, didn't she? Is that why you chose me? Did I remind you of her?" The question hung in the air between them. James stared at his reflection in the window, seeing not the powerful philanthropist but the father who'd lost his child, who'd tried to fill that void with calculated charity. "You gave me an education," Emily continued, her voice softening slightly. "But not the one you intended. I learned that true power isn't in giving, it's in who gets to decide who deserves help." She opened her briefcase, removing a thick folder. "Tomorrow, the New York Times will publish an investigation into charitable foundation practices. Evidence of tax fraud, misappropriated funds, systematic denial of medical assistance to qualifying families. You'll destroy everything." "No, James. I'm going to transform it." Her eyes met his. "The Stewart Foundation has acquired controlling interest in Carter Enterprises. As major shareholder, I'm instituting new policies. Every scholarship will include family medical coverage. Every appeal for assistance will be reviewed by people who understand desperation isn't a liability." James sat back, realization dawning. This was never about revenge. It was about justice. About changing the system that lets rich men play God with poor people's lives. Emily stood, leaving the folder on the table. Your board meets tomorrow. I'll expect your resignation by morning. As she reached the door, James found his voice. Would your mother have wanted this? Emily paused, her hand on the doorknob. My mother wanted me to use my gifts. So I did. I used every lesson you taught me about power, privilege, and the true cost of charity. She turned back one last time. Consider this my thank you note for the scholarship. The door closed behind her with devastating finality. James opened the folder with trembling hands, finding page after page of evidence. Not just of corporate malfeasance, but of a system designed to perpetuate power under the guise of generosity. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering both wealth and poverty in the same blank white, but tomorrow would bring a thaw, and with it a reckoning that would transform the landscape of philanthropy forever. In the end, Emily Stewart had changed more than just the architecture of possibility. She'd demolished it and built something new in its place, a system where charity wasn't a gift from above, but a fundamental right from within. The worst blizzard in 20 years paralyzed Manhattan on the morning of the Carter Enterprises Emergency Board meeting. James hadn't slept, spending the night reviewing Emily's evidence files. Each document, each memo, each denial of assistance formed a damning pattern he could no longer ignore. The Times will publish in 3 hours, Richard reported, his face grave. They're calling it the price of charity, a decade of systematic abuse in corporate philanthropy. Chen provided them with everything. James stared out at the storm, remembering another winter morning when a thin-coated girl had caught his attention. How many families, Richard? How many did we let die while discussing liability? 273, the number hung in the air like an accusation. Emily's foundation saved 400 others. She was doing our job better than we were. The intercom crackled. Mr. Carter? The board members are arriving early. Mr. Winchester seems particularly agitated. Of course he was. Charles Winchester had just discovered his private emails about containing liability issues would be front-page news. His callous dismissal of desperate families' appeals would destroy not just his reputation, but his family's legacy. So his assistant appeared at the door, pale-faced. There's something else. Emily Stewart isn't just coming to the board meeting. She's bringing guests. What guests? Families. Dozens of them. Scholarship recipients whose parents died after being denied assistance. They're gathering in the lobby now. James moved to the window. Below, through the swirling snow, he could see them. People bundled against the cold, holding photographs of lost loved ones. News vans were already arriving, their lights cutting through the storm like searching fingers. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Time to face the true cost of maintaining professional distance. Security cameras showed her entering the building, elegant in white despite the storm. She moved through the crowd of families, stopping to speak with each one. Many hugged her, sharing tears and whispered words. She wasn't just their advocate, she was one of them. The board's demanding answers, Richard said urgently. Emily's legal team just delivered documentation of every questionable decision we've made in the past decade. The overseas accounts, the misappropriated funds, the denied appeals. Let them in, James said quietly. All of them. The families, the press, everyone. It's time we faced what we've done. The snow fell harder as people filled the building's grand lobby. James watched Emily moving among them, no longer the grateful scholarship girl, but a force of nature herself, bringing a storm of accountability to the towers of privilege. In his office, James opened his desk drawer and removed an old photo of Sarah. I tried to honor your memory, he whispered to his daughter's smile, but I think I dishonored it instead. The boardroom doors would open in 30 minutes. Outside, cameras flashed through the storm as more families arrived, their presence a silent testimony to systemic failure. Inside, board members huddled in panic groups, watching their carefully constructed world crumble. Emily's final message appeared on his screen. The architecture of possibility isn't changed by charity from above. It's transformed by justice from within. James straightened his tie, preparing to face not just Emily Stewart, but the true legacy of his philanthropy. The storm outside matched the one about to break within, promising to transform not just Carter Enterprises, but the entire landscape of corporate charity. Sometimes, he realized, the most devastating storms come not from the sky, but from the hearts of those who've learned to turn pain into purpose. The Carter Enterprises boardroom had never felt so small. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow swirled against a steel-gray sky as Emily Stewart took her place at the head of the table, James's usual seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had waited 10 years for this moment. "Let's discuss the true cost of your philanthropy." Charles Winchester erupted first. "This is outrageous. You have no right." "I have every right." Emily's smile was glacial. "As majority shareholder, thanks to your son's rather eager sale of his shares. But we're not here to discuss corporate takeovers." She pressed a button. The boardroom screens lit up with faces, dozens of them. "Meet the people your foundation deemed liability risks. Sarah Williams denied assistance for cancer treatment. Michael Chen's sister refused coverage for emergency surgery. Margaret Stewart, my mother, who died while this board discussed professional distance." James watched his board members shift uncomfortably. These weren't just statistics anymore. They were faces, stories, lives cut short by calculated indifference. "You're destroying decades of charitable work," Richard protested weakly. "Am I?" Emily turned to him. "Tell me, Richard, how many lives did your charity save? Because I can tell you exactly how many it sacrificed. 273 deaths. Each one documented, each one preventable, each one dismissed as a liability concern." She opened a leather portfolio. "I have here board meeting minutes. Discussions about using scholarship recipients' success stories for marketing while denying their families basic medical care. Debates about maintaining appropriate distance while people died waiting for help." "We operated within legal guidelines," Charles sputtered. "Legal?" Emily's laugh was sharp as breaking ice. "Shall we discuss the offshore accounts, Charles? The administrative costs that somehow multiplied in transit? The tax write-offs that benefited board members more than beneficiaries?" James finally found his voice. "Emily, I never meant to let my mother die." Her composure cracked slightly. "To teach a 16-year-old girl that charity is just another form of power. Tell me, James, what did you mean when you ignored those hospital calls?" Silence fell, heavy as the snow outside. In that moment, James saw not the powerful businesswoman, but the desperate girl who had waited by a hospital phone, believing help would come. "What do you want?" Richard asked quietly. Transformation. Emily stood, moving to the windows. "As of this morning, the Stewart Foundation controls Carter Enterprises. Every scholarship will include family medical coverage. Every appeal for assistance will be reviewed by people who understand desperation isn't a liability." She turned back to the board. "Your resignations will be announced today. The Times article exposing your practices goes live in 1 hour. But first," she pressed another button. The boardroom doors opened. Families began filing in, parents, children, siblings of those the foundation had failed. Each carried a photograph. Each had a story that could no longer be ignored. "Look at them," Emily commanded. "Really look. These are the people who paid the price for your professional distance." Charles Winchester stood to leave. "This is emotional manipulation. Like using scholarship success stories in marketing materials." Emily's voice cut him down. "Sit, Charles. You owe them this much." For the next hour, families spoke. Stories of desperation, of pleading letters, of final breaths taken while waiting for help that never came. The board members couldn't look away. Emily had made sure of that. Finally, she turned to James. You taught me everything I know about power, about how charity can be a weapon, about how the architecture of possibility is controlled by those who decide who deserves help. She placed a document before him, his resignation letter. Your daughter, Sarah. Would she be proud of what her memorial scholarship became? James looked at the families, at his shell-shocked board members, at the empire he'd built on the foundation of selective generosity. Then he signed. Outside, the storm began to ease, as if nature itself recognized that something had shifted in the balance of power. Emily Stewart had brought not just revenge, but revolution, transforming the landscape of corporate philanthropy with the same determination that had once earned her a scholarship. The architecture of possibility hadn't just been changed, it had been demolished and rebuilt, this time with justice as its foundation. The New York Times headline blazed across screens worldwide: the dark side of corporate philanthropy, how charitable foundations failed those they promised to help within hours. The story went viral, each revelation more damning than the last. Emily watched from her office as the storm she'd cultivated for 10 years finally broke. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other scholarship recipients, sharing similar stories, offering testimony. The facade of benevolent charity was crumbling, exposed to winter's harsh light. The SEC is launching an investigation, her assistant reported. They're particularly interested in the offshore accounts Mr. Winchester managed, and the Attorney General's office called. They want to discuss the foundation's tax practices. But the real impact came from the personal stories. Social media flooded with photographs, parents who died waiting for assistance, children who lost their chance at treatment, families destroyed by the same system that claimed to help them. Each story traced back to board meeting minutes where their lives were discussed in terms of liability and precedent. James Carter sat alone in his office, watching his life's work unravel. The evidence Emily had gathered was irrefutable, not just of financial misconduct, but of systematic heartlessness disguised as professional procedure. "Did you read the whole article?" Richard asked from the doorway. Including the part about Sarah. James's voice was hollow. How he turned her memorial scholarship into a tool for tax evasion and marketing. Emily's statement is trending. Richard handed him a tablet. "You should see this." On screen, Emily stood before a crowd of reporters, snow falling around her like a veil. "This isn't about revenge," she was saying. "It's about transformation. About building a system where charity isn't a gift bestowed from above, but a fundamental right protected from within." The cameras cut to families sharing their stories. Alexandra Winchester, crying as she described watching Emily's mother die. Thomas Chen revealing how his sister's death had driven him to expose the foundation's practices. Each testimony added another crack to the foundation of privilege. "There's more," Richard said quietly. Emily's team found something in the old records about Sarah's treatment. James looked up sharply. "What about it?" "The experimental therapy that might have saved her?" "The one the hospital said was unavailable." Richard's voice shook. "The foundation board rejected funding it. They decided it would set a dangerous precedent for employees seeking experimental treatments." The revelation hit James like physical blow. His own daughter, victim of the same policies he'd later used to deny help to others. The architecture of privilege had claimed its architect's child first. Outside his window, more reporters gathered in the snow. The story had evolved beyond corporate scandal into a referendum on the nature of charity itself. Emily Stewart hadn't just exposed corruption, she'd sparked a national conversation about the responsibility of wealth. His phone lit up with a final message from Emily. "Check your email. There's something you need to see." The attachment was a simple document, the founding charter for a new organization, combining Carter Enterprises' resources with the Stewart Foundation's mission. The name caught his breath: the Sarah and Margaret Memorial Foundation for Universal Medical Access. "Every life has value," Emily had written. "Every cry for help deserves an answer. This is what true charity looks like." As snow continued to fall on Manhattan, James Carter finally understood. Emily Stewart hadn't just orchestrated his downfall, she'd offered a path to redemption. Not through performative philanthropy, but through genuine transformation. The storm of exposure was clearing, revealing a landscape forever changed. In its wake would rise something new, a system where charity wasn't a tool of power, but a bridge to justice. And somewhere, he hoped, two mothers, Sarah's and Emily's, would finally rest in peace. If this story of justice, redemption, and the true meaning of charity has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription helps us continue sharing powerful narratives that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Join our community as we explore more stories that matter. Together we can make a difference. 3 days after the expose, Manhattan remained buried in snow and scandal. James Carter sat in his darkened penthouse, watching news coverage of his empire's collapse. His phone had been ringing constantly, board members resigning, investors withdrawing, old friends suddenly unavailable. The Attorney General's office called again. Richard said, looking a decade older. They want all foundation records dating back 15 years, and the hospital board. They're removing Sarah's name from the children's wing. That last bit struck deepest. James stared at his daughter's photo, now painful for new reasons. Not just grief for her loss, but the knowledge that the system he'd built had failed her first. "Did you see today's piece about the families?" Richard asked quietly. He had. Each newspaper carried news stories: parents who'd worked multiple jobs while battling illness, children who'd lost parents, while foundation board members discussed liability in heated boardrooms. His own words from old meetings haunted him: "We must maintain professional distance." The doorman called up. "Mr. Carter? There's a Mrs. Williams here to see you." Sarah Williams' mother. One of the first scholarship recipients' parents they'd denied assistance to. James almost refused, but something made him say, "Send her up." She looked older than he remembered, grief etched deep in her face. "My daughter believed in you," she said simply. "Even after you denied our appeal, she defended you, said there must have been a reason." James couldn't meet her eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I'm not here for apologies," her voice hardened. "I'm here because Emily Stewart asked me to deliver this." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a photo he'd never seen: Sarah Williams and his daughter Sarah, together at a school event months before both fell ill. They were smiling, arms linked, unaware of how their fates would intertwine. "They were friends," Mrs. Williams said quietly. "Did you know? When my Sarah was dying, your Sarah brought her homework, sat with her through treatments. She believed everyone deserved a chance to fight." The revelation broke something in James, his daughter showing more humanity than the foundation bearing her name ever had. His phone buzzed. Another headline: Carter Foundation scandal expands, whistleblowers come forward, former employees revealing how they'd been ordered to deny desperate appeals, to maintain professional distance while families shattered. "The worst part," Richard said, reading the article, "is that we believed we were doing good. We really believed our charity was helping." Snow fell outside, obscuring the city James had once ruled. His reputation, his legacy, his carefully constructed world of philanthropic influence, all stripped away, leaving only the harsh truth of what his charity had really meant. Alexandra Winchester had given an interview describing the day she'd watched Emily's mother die. "We were taught that distance meant wisdom," she'd said. But all it really meant was cruelty dressed up as procedure. In his private study, James found old thank you letters from scholarship recipients. Empty words now, knowing how many of their families had suffered while his foundation celebrated its own generosity. The intercom buzzed. His building's board wanted to discuss his continuing residency. Several charities had already removed his name from their donor walls. The hospital was returning his last donation. "It's not just about money," Richard said, watching his friend's world crumble. We lost something more important. We lost the right to call ourselves charitable. Outside, the snow continued its relentless fall, burying the old landmarks of power beneath its clean white truth. James Carter, once celebrated as New York's greatest philanthropist, stood alone in his tower, finally understanding the true cost of maintaining professional distance. It wasn't just his empire he'd lost the right to claim he'd honored his daughter's memory. And that, he realized, watching the city disappear beneath the storm, was a price too heavy for any man to bear. The collapse of Carter Enterprises sent shockwaves through the philanthropic world. Within a week, 5 major charitable foundations launched internal audits. The media dubbed it the Carter Effect, the sudden, devastating exposure of systemic corruption beneath charitable facades. Another foundation's records leaked, Richard reported, scanning headlines on his tablet. The Henderson Foundation. Same pattern: denied medical appeals, offshore accounts, board members profiting from tax write-offs. The New York Times ran a special series, Charity's Dark Heart. How America's philanthropic institutions failed their mission each day brought new revelations, new whistleblowers, new evidence of how the wealthy had turned charity into a tool for tax evasion and social control. Charles Winchester had fled to his villa in Switzerland, but couldn't escape the storm. His son, working with Emily's legal team, had provided evidence of systematic fraud spanning decades. The family name, once synonymous with philanthropic prestige, became a symbol of charitable corruption. The pattern was industry-wide, Emily explained in a televised interview. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a system designed to maintain power while appearing benevolent. Every denied appeal, every family destroyed, it was all by design. Social media exploded with charity fraud stories. Former foundation employees shared their guilt. Scholarship recipients revealed how they'd watched family members die while foundations discussed liability. The carefully maintained wall between givers and receivers crumbled. James watched from his increasingly empty office as other philanthropic empires began to fall. The Pattersons, the Hendersons, the Whitneys, names that had once dominated charity galas now appeared in investigative headlines. The SEC's expanding their investigation, Richard said quietly. They're calling it the largest charitable fraud case in history. Multiple foundations, billions in misappropriated funds, systematic denial of medical assistance, while claiming tax benefits for phantom aid. The Attorney General's press conference was damning these institutions didn't just fail their charitable mission. They actively perverted it, turning human suffering into a tax advantage while maintaining the illusion of philanthropy. Emily Stewart Foundation emerged as a counterpoint, transparent, effective, genuinely focused on saving lives rather than maintaining power. Her model of direct assistance without bureaucratic barriers or professional distance became a blueprint for reform. We've uncovered evidence of coordination, the FBI spokesperson announced. Regular meetings between foundation boards, sharing strategies to maintain what they called appropriate barriers to assistance while maximizing tax benefits. James received the subpoenas with a strange sense of relief. The system he'd helped build, the network of wealthy philanthropists playing gods with poor people's lives, was finally exposed to public scrutiny. Alexandra Winchester gave testimony before a Senate committee. We were taught that distance from recipients was necessary for objective decision-making. In reality, it was necessary to maintain our illusion of moral superiority while people died waiting for help we could easily provide. The snow continued to fall on Manhattan as the philanthropic world imploded. Old structures of power, maintained for generations through selective generosity, collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. Emily's expose hadn't just brought down Carter Enterprises. She'd triggered an avalanche that was burying an entire system of institutionalized indifference disguised as charity. And somewhere in that storm of revelation, the true meaning of philanthropy waited to be reborn. The moment of truth came during a blizzard. Emily sat in her mother's old apartment in the Bronx. now renovated but kept as a reminder. On her laptop, news channels tracked the continuing collapse of America's philanthropic institutions. Her phone buzzed with a message she'd been expecting James Carter wanted to meet. Not in his tower this time. Not in corporate boardrooms or expensive restaurants. Here, where it all began. He arrived looking older than his years, snow-dusting his uncharacteristically rumpled coat. The mighty philanthropist, reduced to asking permission to enter a Bronx apartment. "You kept it," he said, noticing the old scholarship acceptance letter framed on the wall. Along with these, Emily opened a drawer, revealing hospital bills, denied appeals, board meeting minutes, every piece of paper that marked my mother's path to death, every evidence of systemic failure. James moved to the window, the same window where Emily had once watched Manhattan's lights, dreaming of opportunity. "I visited Sarah's grave yesterday," he said quietly. "For the first time since learning about the board's decision on her treatment." "Did you find the answers you were looking for?" "I found something else." He turned to face her. "Your mother's grave. Someone's been leaving flowers. White roses, every week for 10 years. Emily's composure cracked slightly. She loved roses, could never afford them. The card, James continued, was signed Sarah's friend. His voice broke. "My daughter. She was helping your mother secretly, wasn't she? While I was maintaining professional distance." The revelation hung between them. Two daughters, two mothers, lives intertwined by fate and failure. "I didn't know," Emily whispered, "about Sarah's treatment being denied. When I found those records, she stopped, unexpected tears threatening." "We both lost them to the same system." James sank into a chair. "A system I helped build. That's why you had to tear it all down, wasn't it?" Snow fell harder outside, muffling the city's sounds. In that quiet, something shifted between them, survivors recognizing shared wounds. "What happens now?" James asked. Now Emily moved to her mother's old bedroom, returning with a folder. "Now we rebuild." But differently, she handed him the folder. "The Sarah and Margaret Foundation needs a director who understands both sides of charity." James stared at the documents. "You want me to?" "Help transform the system you helped create. Not through distance, but through connection. Not through power, but through understanding." The offer hung between them, redemption wrapped in responsibility. Outside, the storm began to ease, snow turning to gentle flakes. "Sarah would have wanted this," James said finally. "Both Sarahs." Emily nodded, tears finally falling. "Both mothers, too." As night fell over the Bronx, two people who had begun as benefactor and recipient, evolved through enemy and victim, found themselves becoming something else, partners in transformation. The breaking point hadn't just shattered the old system. It had created space for something new to grow from the wreckage of professional distance and performative philanthropy. Sometimes they would both learn the deepest wounds create the strongest bridges. 1 month after the breaking point, Emily stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University. The audience included former scholarship recipients, foundation whistleblowers, and families who had lost loved ones to systemic indifference. But it also included James Carter, sitting quietly in the back row. "People think this was about revenge," Emily began, snow falling softly outside the windows. "They think I spent 10 years plotting to destroy James Carter's empire, but they've missed the point entirely." She clicked to the first slide, her mother's hospital bill alongside the foundation's denial letter. This was about transformation, about understanding that true change doesn't come from tearing down systems, but from rebuilding them with justice at their core. The next slide showed the Sarah and Margaret Foundation's new organizational structure. No boardrooms making life and death decisions, no professional distance. Instead, a council that included former recipients, medical professionals, and family members who had experienced loss. We've created something unprecedented, Emily continued. A foundation where every decision-maker has lived the experience of needing help, where empathy isn't a liability, but a qualification. James watched from his seat as she revealed the full scope of her decade-long plan. The corporate takeovers hadn't been about revenge, they'd been about acquiring resources for a complete overhaul of charitable giving. Every company I acquired, Emily explained, had a specific purpose. Henderson Technologies. Their medical review software is being reprogrammed to prioritize need over liability. Patterson Global's investment network, now funding emergency medical assistance worldwide. The audience sat stunned as she outlined the new model. The Stewart Carter initiative would combine corporate efficiency with humanitarian purpose. No more tax write-offs disguised as charity. No more deaths while boards discussed precedents. But the most important change, Emily's voice softened, is in how we view the relationship between givers and receivers. She clicked to a final slide, a split image. On one side, her mother's grave. On the other, Sarah Carter's. These two deaths taught us something crucial. In the end, we're all just people needing help. The only difference is who gets to decide when that help comes. James stood quietly and walked to the podium. The audience tensed, but Emily nodded for him to speak. I built a system, he said, his voice carrying years of regret, that turned charity into a weapon of power. Emily Stewart didn't just expose that system, she's created its replacement. Together, they announced the initiative's first action: full medical coverage for all scholarship recipients' families, retroactive to the foundation's beginning. The cost would be covered by the sale of board members' private assets, starting with James's own fortune. This isn't charity, Emily concluded. This is justice. This is what happens when we stop maintaining professional distance and start maintaining human connection. As the audience rose in a standing ovation, snow continued to fall outside, no longer a barrier between worlds but a blank page waiting for a new story to be written. The real agenda had never been destruction. It had been reconstruction of systems, of values, of the very meaning of philanthropic responsibility. Spring was approaching, but snow still dusted Manhattan as James Carter began his new role at the Sarah and Margaret Foundation. His corner office replaced with a modest workspace, his Italian suits exchanged for more practical attire. Each morning he sat alongside former scholarship recipients, learning to view charity through their eyes. Your 9 a.m. is here, his assistant announced, Mrs. Chen from the Emergency Appeals Committee. Thomas Chen's sister's widow, once denied assistance by his foundation, now helping reshape its policies. The symmetry wasn't lost on James. We need to discuss the Henderson case, Mrs. Chen said, placing a file before him. Single mother, 3 kids, advanced cancer. Under the old system, she would have been denied. James opened the file, remembering countless similar cases he'd dismissed with corporate detachment. And now, treatment begins tomorrow. Emily already approved it. Mrs. Chen's eyes held both challenge and hope. She said you'd want to deliver the news personally. It was part of Emily's redemption protocol, former board members personally informing families of approved assistance. No more letters, no more professional distance, face-to-face responsibility for life-changing decisions. Later that day, Emily found him in the hospital waiting room, still emotional from meeting the Henderson family. It never gets easier, does it? She asked softly. It shouldn't, he replied. That was our first mistake, making it easy to deny help. They walked to the foundation's new family support center, once a luxury boardroom. Now it housed social workers, medical coordinators, and former recipients turned advocates. Alexandra Winchester called. Emily mentioned, she's joining our advocacy team. Says she's done hiding behind family legacy. The transformation spread beyond their foundation. Other philanthropic organizations, sensing the changing tide, began adopting their model. Transparency replaced secrecy. Empathy replaced efficiency. Human connection replaced professional distance. James paused at a wall of photographs recipients and their families, including his daughter Sarah and Emily's mother Margaret. Do you think they'd understand what we're trying to build? Sarah already understood, Emily replied. Those roses she left at my mother's grave. She knew what real charity meant before any of us. That evening they reviewed applications together, not in a boardroom, but in the same Bronx apartment where Emily's mother had once struggled to pay heating bills. You know what I realized, James said, looking at Manhattan's lights through her old window. We're not just helping people, we're healing ourselves. Emily nodded, remembering winter nights spent studying under blankets. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about using it to build a better future. Outside, the last snow of winter began to melt, revealing the first signs of spring. Like the thawing city below, the path to redemption wasn't instant or easy. It required daily commitment, constant self-examination, and the courage to face those they had once failed. But with each family helped, each life saved, each wrong acknowledged and addressed, something new grew from the frozen ground of past mistakes. They were building more than a new charitable model. They were creating a template for redemption itself, one that recognized that true healing required more than money or power. It required the willingness to break down walls, both literal and metaphorical, between those who give and those who receive. As night fell over the city, James and Emily continued their work, no longer benefactor and recipient, no longer adversaries, but partners in transformation. Sometimes they were learning the longest path to redemption is the one that leads us back to our shared humanity. The last snow of winter was melting when Emily discovered the letters. Hidden in Sarah Carter's old school locker, preserved by a thoughtful janitor, dozens of them, spanning months before both girls fell ill. Correspondence between two friends facing different sides of the same broken system. Dad's foundation denied another appeal today, Sarah had written. A girl's mother, dying of the same thing that's killing me. They don't know I overheard the board meeting. They used words like liability and precedent. I don't understand how they can be so cold. Emily's hands trembled as she read the final letter, dated 3 days before Sarah's death. Dear Emily's mom, I know we've never met, but your daughter is my friend. I hear them talking about denying your appeal. I've tried to change their minds, but I'm running out of time myself. I'm leaving you my savings. It's not much, but maybe it can help. Please don't tell Emily. Sometimes the only way to fight a broken system is to work around it. Love, Sarah Carter. The revelation struck like lightning. The mysterious deposits in her mother's account. The roses at the grave. Sarah hadn't just been Emily's friend, she'd been her first ally in the fight against systemic indifference. James found Emily in his daughter's old room, letters scattered around her. I always wondered, he said softly, why Sarah asked to review Foundation documents in her final weeks. She was gathering evidence, wasn't she? Emily nodded, unable to speak. In her hand was a final document, Sarah's last amendment to her memorial scholarship requirements the board had ignored. Recipients' families must receive the same care I was denied. No distance, no barriers, no one dies alone while others discuss liability. She knew James whispered. About everything. The board's decisions, the denied appeals, even her own treatment being rejected. Emily stood, facing the man she'd spent years planning to destroy. She wanted to change it from within. When that failed, she gestured to the letters. She tried to save what she could, including my mother. The weight of this truth settled over them. Their entire story, the scholarship, the revenge, the transformation, had been guided by Sarah's invisible hand. That's why you really built the Shadow Foundation, James realized. You were finishing what she started. Emily picked up Sarah's final letter. She wrote that real change doesn't come from destroying systems, but from transforming them. That's why the Stewart Foundation never just attacked, we always rebuilt. As spring sunshine broke through the clouds, they understood at last. Their journey hadn't been about revenge or redemption alone. It had been about fulfilling a dying girl's vision of what charity could be. Sarah Carter, in her final days, had planted seeds of change. Emily Stewart had spent 10 years helping them grow. And now James Carter would help them bloom. She would have changed the world, James said, looking at his daughter's photo. She did, Emily replied softly. Through all of us. Outside, the last snow melted away, revealing new growth beneath. Like Sarah's hidden letters, sometimes the deepest truths lie, waiting for the right moment to emerge, transforming not just those who discover them, but the very world they inhabit. The final revelation wasn't just about the past. It was a blueprint for the future, one where charity flows not from duty or power, but from the simple, profound understanding that we are all connected in our humanity. Sarah Carter had known this truth. Now, at last, so did they. 1 year after Sarah's letters were discovered, the Sarah and Margaret Foundation headquarters opened in a renovated community hospital in the Bronx. No gleaming towers, no marble lobbies, just open spaces where those seeking help could find it without barriers. "Welcome to our new model," Emily addressed the gathered crowd, standing beside James, "where every office is accessible, every decision transparent, and every life valued equally." The transformation was comprehensive. The old Carter Enterprises boardroom became a family support center. Executive suites were converted into medical consultation spaces. The art collection that once graced corporate halls now hung in treatment rooms, bringing beauty to those fighting for survival. Today we announce our first initiative. James stepped forward, changed man in posture and purpose. Full medical coverage for every scholarship recipient's family, past and present. But more importantly, we're changing how charitable assistance works. The new system was revolutionary in its simplicity. No more board votes on who deserved to live. No more professional distance. Instead, decisions were made by councils including medical professionals, former recipients, and family members who had experienced loss themselves. Alexandra Winchester, now heading the advocacy department, presented the numbers. In 1 year. We've helped more families than the old foundation did in a decade. Not because we have more resources, but because we removed the barriers between giving and receiving. The former scholarship recipients who once served as marketing success stories now sat on advisory boards, their experiences shaping policies. Thomas Chen's department developed an algorithm that prioritized need over liability. The Pattersons' overseas accounts were transformed into emergency medical funds. But the most profound change was visible in the small details. The welcome desk staffed by people who had once been denied help. The walls covered with photos of families helped and lives saved. The memorial garden where 2 names, Sarah Carter and Margaret Stewart, reminded everyone of why the transformation mattered. This isn't just a foundation anymore, Emily concluded. It's a movement. Every organization adopting our model, every life saved, every barrier broken. This is Sarah's legacy. Both Sarahs. James watched from the side, remembering his daughter's hidden letters. She had seen what he couldn't, that true charity requires not just resources, but revolution. Not just giving, but transformation. The spring sun shone through new windows, touching the plaque that bore both girls' final words: no distance, no barriers, no one fights alone. The company hadn't just changed its practices. It had changed the very definition of philanthropic responsibility, and somewhere 2 mothers and 2 daughters watched their shared vision become reality. On a bright spring morning, Emily Stewart and James Carter stood before 2 graves, white roses in their hands. The simple headstones, now linked by a shared garden path, told a story deeper than revenge or redemption. "I used to come here filled with anger," Emily said softly, placing roses on her mother's grave. "Every visit was fuel for my plan to destroy your empire." "And now?" James asked, laying flowers at Sarah's headstone. "Now I understand what Sarah knew all along." Real change isn't about destruction, it's about transformation. They sat on a bench between the graves, watching cherry blossoms drift in the morning breeze. The weight of their shared history had transformed into something neither had expected: partnership in healing. Alexandra called this morning, James mentioned. The Winchester Foundation is adopting our model. Charles finally signed over control. His last words before leaving for Switzerland were, "Sarah would have wanted this." Emily nodded. She did want it. Those letters, she touched the worn pages she always carried. She saw what we all missed, that the system wasn't just failing the poor. It was failing everyone, even those at the top. The Foundation's latest report lay between them. Statistics that told a story of transformation: thousands of families helped, lives saved, barriers broken. But the real change was in the small moments: James personally delivering approval notices, Emily mentoring new scholarship recipients, both of them sitting with families through long hospital nights. "Margaret would be proud," James said quietly. "Not just of the foundation, but of you. You didn't just tear down walls, you built bridges." "Sarah would be proud too," Emily replied. "You become the man she always believed you could be." They had developed a tradition: monthly visits to these graves, sharing updates like parents reporting to children. Today's news was especially significant. The Sarah and Margaret Medical Center would open in the Bronx, offering free care to families caught in the same gaps that had claimed their loved ones. Sometimes, James reflected, watching the blossoms fall, I wonder if this was their plan all along. Sarah's letters, your mother's struggle. Maybe they knew it would take both of our pain to create real change. Emily reached for the locket she always wore, opening it to reveal two small photos: her mother and Sarah, connected by fate and purpose. They taught us what real charity means. Not giving from above, but lifting from within. As they left the cemetery, the morning sun caught the new plaque at the entrance to their shared garden: from loss, legacy. From pain, purpose. From distance, connection. The transformation wasn't just in their work, it was in them. James had learned to feel again, to see beyond spreadsheets to human stories. Emily had learned that revenge could become renewal, that justice could wear the face of mercy. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the longest journey isn't from poverty to wealth, or from powerlessness to power, but from isolation to connection. From professional distance to human embrace. And in that discovery, both Sarah and Margaret's dreams had finally come true. A year later, Winter returned to Manhattan. In the Sarah and Margaret Foundation's entrance hall, a new scholarship recipient stood nervously, wearing a second-hand coat that reminded Emily of herself from years ago. Sophia Martinez. Emily stepped forward. "I'm Emily Stewart. And this is James Carter." The girl's mother coughed weakly beside her, the same cough that had once echoed in another Bronx apartment. But this time the story would be different. "Mrs. Martinez," James said gently, "your daughter's scholarship includes full medical coverage for your entire family. Treatment starts tomorrow." Sophia's eyes widened. "But the other foundation said—" "We're not like other foundations," Emily interrupted softly. "Here we understand that talent shouldn't have to choose between education and family survival." James led them to the Family Support Center, once his opulent boardroom. On its walls hung two portraits: Sarah Carter and Margaret Stewart, smiling down at the families they now helped save. "Your mother's cancer," Emily said to Sophia. "It's the same type that took Sarah Carter. The treatment she was denied, it's the one we're giving you." Sophia's mother began to cry, but these were different tears from those Emily remembered shedding. These were tears of relief, of hope, of barriers finally broken. Later, after the Martinez family left with their approval papers, Emily found James staring out at the falling snow. "Thinking about Sarah," she asked, "and Margaret, and how it took losing them to teach us what they already knew, that real charity isn't about maintaining distance, it's about closing it. Through the window, they watched Sophia and her mother leave, their figures bright against the white snow. Another story beginning, but this time with a different ending. The Foundation's annual report sat on Emily's desk, but the real measure of their success wasn't in numbers. It was in moments like this: lives changed, families saved, cycles broken. "You know what today is?" James asked quietly. Emily nodded. 10 years exactly since she'd stood in his office, a girl in a thin coat with determination in her heart. Everything's changed since then. "Not everything," James smiled. "You still have that same look in your eyes, the one that says impossible is just a starting point." They walked together through the Foundation's halls, past rooms filled with families receiving help, past walls covered with stories of lives saved. The professional distance that had once divided giver from receiver had been replaced by something more powerful: human connection. Outside, snow continued to fall on Manhattan, no longer a barrier between worlds but a blank page for new stories to be written. Stories of healing, of transformation, of justice wearing the face of mercy. In the end, it wasn't about revenge or redemption. It wasn't even about charity. It was about fulfilling a promise made by two daughters to two mothers that someday no one would have to die alone while others discussed liability. The Sarah and Margaret Foundation had become more than either Emily or James had imagined, not just a place where lives were saved, but where the very meaning of giving was transformed. As night fell over the city, two portraits watched over their legacy: a scholarship girl and a millionaire's daughter, who had somehow reached across death itself to teach the living what true charity means. Sometimes the greatest distances closed are not those between rich and poor, but between the heart's capacity for indifference and its potential for compassion. And in that closing, every winter holds the promise of spring. Doesn't this story deserve your subscription? Please click the subscribe button, like and share it with your family members. Don't forget to share your lessons learned and feelings in the comments below. Once again, our team extends our deepest gratitude to all viewers who have supported our channel.